Boa tarde, todos e todas e todos. Sejam bem-vindos a mais um programa do nosso programa de pós-graduação em História da Universidade Federal de Pernambuco. É um prazer tê-los e tê-las aqui novamente conosco, nesse programa. Este é um vídeo que será gravado, então vocês poderão acessar esse programa também mais tarde, mas já deixo meus agradecimentos a todos que estão participando aqui nesta tarde conosco. É uma tarde muito especial, porque nós temos um convidado muito especial para nos proporcionar, aqui nos presentear com uma palestra nesta tarde. Então, eu vou apresentar o professor Günther Schörner, que está aqui conosco nesta tarde, e vou falar um pouco da biografia dele. Na verdade, seriam páginas e páginas para ler, mas eu vou ler um pouquinho aqui sobre o trabalho que o professor Schörner desenvolveu já nos últimos anos, na parte de arqueologia clássica, e depois, então, ele vai começar a palestra dele para nós, tá bom? Então, eu gostaria de ler um pouco sobre o professor Günther. Eu já agradeço, deixo meus agradecimentos iniciais. Thank you, Professor Schörner, for staying here with us this afternoon. Okay, I'll come back to you later on, right? Eu vou fazer a apresentação do professor Günther em português, e depois, então, ele começa a palestra dele, que será feita em inglês, tá bom? Então, o que eu devo dizer é que o professor Günther é um grande especialista nos estudos clássicos, Ele trabalha com a cultura material já há muitos anos e tem se dedicado nos últimos tempos à arqueologia do mundo romano, Seus interesses de pesquisa têm um tema abrangente, a saber, questões de mudanças na vida durante e após a incorporação ao Império Romano em regiões muito diferentes do Império. O professor Schörner tenta abordar esse fenômeno complexo, que no passado foi muitas vezes referido como romanização ou aculturação, de diferentes maneiras, procurando meticulosamente aplicar diferentes métodos que também foram desenvolvidos em outras disciplinas científicas, além da arqueologia. A transparência no procedimento é particularmente importante para o professor Schörner. O foco principal está em duas áreas, o assentamento rural. O assentamento em áreas rurais é muito menos pesquisado do que nas cidades, E como há muito menos fontes escritas disponíveis, a cultura material deve ser interpretada primeiro. As questões centrais, portanto, só podem ser esclarecidas com a ajuda de pesquisas no campo arqueológico, de modo que o professor Schörner realiza escavações na Itália e pesquisas na Turquia e em outros lugares em cooperação internacional. Além de questões metodológicas e cronológicas gerais, mudanças concretas no mundo dos bens de vida também e da arquitetura aos hábitos culinários são objeto de pesquisa do professor Schörner. Também estuda os cultos, com base na iconografia de rituais centrais, como o sacrifício em diferentes partes do Império, examina em que medida práticas de cultos anteriores e suas representações são alteradas ou mantidas no campo de tensão entre tradição e adaptação. Recentemente, ele também tem lidado com cultos em cultos em residências, também, especialmente com conexão entre objetos de culto e realização de rituais. Desde dezembro de 2013, ele é porta-voz da Universidade de Viena para os assuntos relacionados à cultura material. Seu currículo inclui uma vasta quantidade de publicações. Aqui nós ficaremos um bom tempo falando das publicações do professor, então, para que a gente faça esse resumo, então eu li essa apresentação inicial dele, porque vocês podem encontrar na internet as informações sobre as publicações do professor Günther, tá bom? Então, sem mais delongas, eu apresento o professor Günther. Thank you very much for staying here with us this afternoon. All right, it's going to be an enriching lecture for all of us. So welcome, everyone. Here's Professor Günther Schörner. Thank you.
So, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for that very long, and I didn't understand all, but it was a very flattering introduction, and I'm glad to stay here. It would be better to meet you personally, but I'm very happy to be here in Recife, and we are going to hear about something about North Africa and memory in Roman North Africa in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE. In a very influential article published 1996, Greg Wolf postulated a kind of historical forgetfulness for the Western, that are the Latin-speaking provinces of the Roman Empire. Thus he wrote, I quote, "One of the most striking features of the early Roman culture of the Western provinces of the empire is the absence of any independent memory of a past before the conquest of Rome. Especially in regard, quote end, especially in regard to northern Africa," he continues, quote again, "the differences between Punic societies, urbanized Hellenistic city-states with complex political institutions and some form of literature, in the very different communities of late prehistoric Spain and Gaul, make it all the more striking that their memories of the pre-Roman past seem similarly exiguous." Quote end. At first glance, Greg Wolf seems to be right. When we compare the evidence from Western and Northern Europe, but also from Northern Africa, with literary sources, inscriptions, and iconographical and archaeological evidence stemming from the Greek East, we recognize a significant scantiness of relevant sources, but it is to question that it does really mean that the past became meaningless there after the conquest and the new system of references replaced its memory. Nevertheless, for the Latin West, the questions if the indigenous past has really been seen as irrelevant after the Roman annexation, and if new cultural patterns of meaning supersede traditional memory, are issues to be studied. As Alexandra Busch put it, German archaeologist, did the convert have no historical consciousness, or did they lose it in the course of the profound changes that resulted from the conquest by Rome? Quote end. That indigenous societies in the west of the Roman Empire actually forgot their past seems very unlikely in the light of recent anthropological and sociological research. To the contrary, Eric Hobsbawm suggests something different with the concept of invention of tradition. Here, the book cover on the left side, in the middle, it's the book where I quote from Alexandra Busch. Eric Hobsbawm suggests something different with the concept of invention of tradition. He regards references to a suitable past and the creation of traditions as useful means to construct and affirm identity for societies that are under social pressure or in situations of profound cultural change. It is to be doubted that such practices did not occur in the Latin West, where that happened, said social pressure and profound cultural change. And therefore, Greg Wolf's statement has been examined and partly contradicted in recent years. One of these new voices against a forgetful West, so to say, is that of Andrew C. Johnston. He published in 2017 a study entitled "The Sons of Remus, Identity in Roman Gaul and Spain," here on the right side. Based on extensive epigraphic and literary evidence, this author argues convincingly for the importance of local identity in the Roman West, whereby he challenges or at least supplements the actual orthodoxy of becoming Roman and for the significance of the pre-Roman past in the social life of provincial communities in Gaul and Spain. This talk, this Palestra, is in line with these studies and examines cultural memory of the past as expression of historical consciousness and means of identity building in Roman Imperial North Africa. The main question is therefore what kinds of references to an indigenous or at least pre-Roman past can be traced. One of the most apt and most promising regions for the discovery of historical consciousness and identity building fed by cultural memory in the Latin West is North Africa, especially the Roman provinces of Africa Proconsularis and Numidia, here in purple and green. There are several reasons for this. The two most important are, firstly, the source material from Roman North Africa is extremely rich and diverse. Thus, an enormous amount of epigraphical, archaeological, iconographical, and even literary evidence is to be analyzed. And secondly, in pre-imperial times, Carthago, established an empire that was politically, economically, and culturally on par with Rome. Therefore, there are points of reference for cultural memories on a pre-Roman past. In the following minutes, I will try to examine, firstly, whether, and if yes, what kinds of references to an indigenous or at least pre-Roman past can be traced, and secondly, which general strategy is followed by those references. Because most of you are classicists, I presume.
Many.
I will not start with hardcore archaeology, but I would like to address literary sources first. But what really counts is another fact. Literary sources, written from an emic perspective, form a good starting point to look for testimonies of cultural memory and consciousness of a pre-Roman past, since they are most explicit than archaeological sources, which have to be examined and interpreted by different means. By that, it will become evident that one of the most important strategies to deal with the Punic past is the postulation and construction of seemingly unbroken lines of tradition from pre-conquest, that is pre-Roman times, till the actual Roman present. A key text in that respect is Tertullian's Tepalio on the cloth, especially the first paragraph. Here the Latin text, but don't be afraid, here comes the translation. I read some of or most of the text. You who have always been leaders of Africa, men of Carthage, noble of old and blessed today, I am glad that you live in such happy times that you can find both the time and the pleasure of censoring clothing. This is the sort of pursuit of peace and plenty. All is well on the part of the empire and on the part of the sky. However, in the past, you too wore your clothing, tunics differently. They were even famous for their skillful weave, harmonious coloring, and proper size. For they did not fall extravagantly over the legs or shamelessly above the knees. They did not fit shortly at the arms nor tightly at the hands. No, in a fourfold suitable form it fitted men. It was not considered easy to divide its folds with a belt. The outer garment, the pallium, itself also quadrangular, was thrown back from both sides and knit around the neck in the bight of a buckle and so rested on the shoulders. Its equivalent today is what is worn by the priest of Aesculapius, who also has become yours. This is the way the twin town, that is Utica, close by, used to dress, and wherever else in Africa there is a Tyre. There is a Tyrus, the famous city on the Phoenician coast in the east, nowadays Lebanon. But as soon as the urn of worldly lots swung around and the deity favored the Romans, your twin town hastened to change on its own account. Thus it wished to salute Scipio at his landing beforehand through its prematurely Roman attire. To you, however, after the benefit of injustice, as to people who had lost their antiquity but not their position after the foul omens of Gracchus and the violent mockery by Lepidus, the threefold ardors of Pompeius and the long delays of Caesar, when Statilius Taurus had erected your walls and Sentius Saturninus had solemnly inaugurated them, and since concord was pleasing to you, the toga was offered. How far did it wander? From the Pelasgians it came to the Lydians, and from the Lydians to the Romans. In order that to cover the Carthaginians, starting from the shoulders of the higher people. From then on your tunic is longer and you use a dividing belt to let it hang down. Likewise, you support the abundant flow of your now smooth gown by gathering it in folds. And if any circumstance of class or dignity or time makes you wear the other garments, you forget and even criticize the pallium that used to be yours in all circumstances. I will skip the last part, and the last sentence is then, this way the pallium is also no longer recognized. I will not delve into the philological subtleties, but take the text as a document of the cultural climate in Carthage of the beginning 3rd century CE. Generally, it is a learned declamatory speech about clothing with strong African undertones, as Vincent Hunning put it, the last translator and commentator of the text. The text postulates a remarkable contrast between the local culture of Carthage, which is deliberately coined as African, and Roman culture. The audience, surely Carthaginians as Tertullian himself, is reminded of Carthage's greatness and the splendid achievements of the past, which have become obsolete after the Romans destroyed Carthago, Carthage, and founded a new colonia, like wearing the pallium. The old Punic habit of clothing was abandoned, and instead the Roman-style tunica and toga was adopted. Tertullian highlights that the adoption of Roman customs in a kind of self-Romanization, so to say, could happen even before the formal establishment of Roman rule, as the case of the Twin City Utica shows. It still exists, however, an equivalent of the archaic Punic tunic and pallium, which is the attire of the Asclepius priest in Carthage. This implies that it retained old traditional forms, hinting at a kind of cultic continuity. The contrast with Rome is further sharpened by the suggestion that some Roman achievements, like the battering ram, that's in the part of the text, in the passage of the text, which I didn't read, were not original Roman at all. Historically, Tertullian's assertion is not likely, but it strengthens his argument of Carthage as innovative and self-conscious, but also as powerful polity. In general, these points are made in Tertullian's text or by Tertullian, which are crucial for the discussion about cultural memory and the invention of traditions. Firstly, the existence of a typical pre-Roman African way of clothing. Secondly, the abandonment of a cultural habitus in a time of crisis, namely the conquest by Rome. But also, thirdly, the still existing tradition of African clothing in the sphere of religion. And fourthly, the possibility to return to the pre-Roman practice as an act of self-determination. Most interesting is the claim made by Tertullian that the clothing habits of the priests of Asclepius are following Punic traditions. However, it goes against all what we know about the cult of Asclepius in imperial times. The Punic temple for Eschmoun, the Punic predecessor and equivalent to Asclepius, stood on the Byrsa. I hope you can. On the Byrsa, Byrsa is over here, that small hill above the sea with the two harbors. That's the famous War harbor, the harbor for the ships of war. The Byrsa formed the very center of the Punic city, Punic Carthage. Livius and later Apuleius refer to the temple, while servants of the temple of Eschmoun are mentioned in several Punic inscriptions. According to literary sources, namely Strabo and Appian, it was the site of the last stand of the Carthaginians in 146 BCE. The Byrsa was the main target of the Roman destruction and an object of enormous restructuration under Augustus. In consequence, the topography of the hill has been completely modified. In general, the new Roman platform on the Byrsa was far below the Punic level. This disposal of the Punic surface has been interpreted also in religious terms as a means to decursing and suspending the ban to settle on the ground of the Punic city. Thus, it is highly improbable that a Punic cult with such an eminent political significance was allowed to be continued. Some archaeologists postulate an Augustan rebuilding of the temple of Asclepius on the Byrsa, but the Augustan layers are disturbed and it is difficult to gain a clear picture of the building history there. It is sure that the main concentration of monumental buildings existed already in Augustan times, with the Basilica, here number 2, and the Capitolium, here on that square, a temple for Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva on the main space. The second space here was dominated by a second large temple, number 6, which sometimes is believed that it has been dedicated to Asclepius. Recent studies, however, favor Concordia, a denomination which would stress the political intention of founding the colony, expressing concord. Based on the epigraphic evidence, the cult of Asclepius in Carthage was refounded as late as the Antonine period, that is in the middle and late 2nd century CE, and it is possible that the Ordo of the colony instituted it as at this time, and only that late a temple was built. There is no secure archaeological evidence for Roman temple of Asclepius, but an inscription has been found rebuilt in the theater near the Byrsa, and a large votive vase directly on the Byrsa. So we have hints for a localization or at the localization of a Roman temple on the Byrsa again. During the Antonine reconstruction of the great Augustan Platea esplanade on the Byrsa hill, a small temple was built, here number 10, on the western end of the southern plaza. That building would be very fitting to house the newly re-established cult of Asclepius. So we may encounter a deliberate refunding and also redesigning of the cult in that time, but there was surely no continuity of cult and therefore no continuity of priesthoods for Asclepius. Continuity of cult and cult paraphernalia is mentioned in ancient sources, also in connection with Dea Celestis, one of the city's most prominent deities. The historian Herodian writes in Greek about about the religious transgressions of the infamous emperor Elagabalus in the early 3rd century CE, and describes the theft of a cult statue. But proclaiming that his god was not pleased by a goddess of war wearing full armor, that is Athena, he sent for the statue of Urania, which the Carthaginians and Libyans especially venerate. This statue, they say, Dido, the Phoenician, set up at the time when she cut the hide into stripes and founded the ancient city of Carthage. The Libyans call this goddess Urania, but the Phoenicians worship her as Astroarche, identifying her with the moon. Calestis was still more important as deity to Carthage than Asclepius. This goddess is generally identified as the Roman successor to the Punic goddess Tanit. So, for example, in the sanctuary of Tinisut, which according to a Neo-Punic inscription was dedicated to Baal and Tanit, while in the Roman period dedications were made to Saturn, to whom I come later, and Calestis. Tanit was the chief patron deity of Punic Carthage, but the cult of Punic Tanit has evidently disappeared along with the rest of the Punic city, and thus the cult was disrupted. The earliest reference to the cult of Calestis in Roman Carthage is a passage in Apuleius, the Golden Ass. Here he describes Calestis as a virgin riding across the sky on a lion. It is no case, not by chance, that the same iconography is used on coins since Marcus Aurelius. Especially in Severan time, coins with Calestis were minted very often. Here you see a denarius of Septimius Severus from minted in 203 CE, with the goddess here riding on the back of a lion. Yes, the head, yes, the tail. So Calestis has become one of the main deities of Carthage again, and the ordo of the city, so the local government of the city, must have formally instituted her cult and have built a temple. As G.B. Rives stated, it is probably that this event took place under the rule of Marcus Aurelius, at the latest under the Severans. The Carthaginian bishop Vuldeus, what a name, living in the 5th century, gives a short description of the building, which must have been enormous. According to this bishop, Vuldeus, the temple had a large walled courtyard, mosaic pavement, columns of precious stones, and various shrines. Here you see the plateas litostrata pavimento ad pretiosis columnis et moenibus decorata, and so on. Thus, it corresponds in many respects to temples of other archaeologically much better known sanctuaries in imperial Africa. As is shown by Herodian, the Carthaginians, the ordo and the people, have believed that they were literally worshipping the same goddess as their Punic predecessors had done. The material expression for that continuity is the cult statue, which was believed to be inherited from the time of Dido, that is, since the mythological past when Carthage was founded. Thus, the Roman imperial cult was viewed as a continuation of the Punic cult. It is evident that in instituting the cult of Calestis, the ordo consciously tried to re-establish the cult of a goddess whom they know as one of the main deities of Punic Carthage. By re-establishing the cult as sacrum publicum, as publicly funded cult, the Order of Carthage stressed continuity and the Punic legacy, reclaiming a glorious non-Roman past. Thus, it is especially the cult of Caelestis at Carthage in Roman times which may serve to build a specific Carthaginian identity. According to all archaeological evidence, the cult, however, was objectively disrupted for more than 200 years. In contrast to the old Greek cults like the Ephesian Artemis, both the city and the cult of Caelestis experienced a radical discontinuity. Also, the rituals performed in honor of Caelestis differed considerably. Augustine gives a short account of the rites performed, which he witnessed as a student. The ceremonies he describes did not differ significantly from most other Greco-Roman cults. Especially the ludi were often presented in a cultic context. Ludos, for example, here. Where and when those initiated in the mysteries of Caelestis received any good instructions, we know not. What we do know is that before her shrine, in which her image is set in the midst of a vast crowd gathering from all quarters and standing closely packed together, we were intensely interested spectators of the games which were going on, and saw, as we pleased to turn the eye, on this side a grand display of harlots, on the other the virgin goddess. We saw this virgin worship with prayer and with obscene rites. There we saw no shamefaced mimes, no actors overburdened with modesty. All that the obscene rites demanded was fully complied with. The organization of public cult, however, seems to differ from Roman practice. Augustine mentions the Sacrati Caelestis in the first line, it's here. The devotees of Caelestis. Evidence from other cities allows us to reconstruct a hierarchic priestly organization. In inscriptions regarding the public cult of Caelestis found at Cirta, priests of the first rank and the second rank are attested, together with attendants like female and male pasket carriers, canistrari e canistrariae. It is likely enough that the cult of Caelestis at Carthage had a similar sort of hierarchic organization, which is in contrast to Roman practices. It may recall all the Punic concepts of priesthood in the religious organization, but the entire organization was only just established in the 2nd century CE. It is, however, evident that in instituting the cult of Caelestis, the order consciously tried to re-establish the cult of a goddess, whom they know as the patron deity of the lost Punic city. The Ordo stressed continuity and the Punic legacy, reclaiming a glorious non-Roman past. Most interestingly, that activity was not only tolerated but even appreciated by Rome and the Roman emperors, as it is shown by the participation of emperors in constructing the public temples, minting medallions, and granting privileges. In general, it can be stated that the Sacra Publica of Carthage have undergone a transformation since founding of the colony. By the second half of the 2nd century CE, at least, some cults which have been regarded as successors of pre-Roman Punic practices were integrated into the pantheon of the community of gods of the city. So also distinctively non-Roman traits were implemented, reinvented, like the organization of priests in the cult of Caelestis, although many other features follow the common Roman imperial model. Aside Asclepius and Calestis, also other deities were involved, like Ceres, or in plural the Cereres, in whose cult also a priestly hierarchy uncommon to Roman regulations is attested. The changes in the cult of the most venerated, and by that the most important god in Roman North Africa, Saturn, cannot be examined at Carthage and by means of epigraphical and literary texts alone, so I come to archaeology. By far it is commonly believed, at least since the monumental work of Marcel Leclerc, written 60 years ago, that Saturn is the Roman successor of the old Punic or Libyan Punic deity Baal Hamon. But as in the case of Denet Calestis, the continuity is more constructed than real, or rather than real. An instructive example of these breaks and invented traditions is the veneration of Baal Hamon and Saturn at Tuga. Here, the role alleged continuity and memories of pre-Roman past was stressed is to be traced on basis of archaeological evidence. Tuga, can you see here? It's a town in the Tunisian Tell. It's in the highlands, southwest of Carthage, around in a distance of about 100 kilometers. Tuga was under Carthaginian control until the middle of the 2nd century BCE. Then it was taken over by the Numidian king Massinissa until Caesar annexed Numidia in 46 BCE. After the formation of the province Africa Proconsularis in Augustan times, Tuga became part of the Carthaginian territorium, the territorium of the Roman colonia, of the Roman town Carthago. For then on, Tuga existed as a so-called double community consisting of the original town, the civitas, and the Roman settlers from the colonia Carthago de Pagus. The general organization was like that of Roman towns, but the chief magistrates were described as suffetes, a Punic term, terminus. In those political terms, the cult of Saturn has to be seen. We know more about that because of excavations. At Tuga, a sanctuary for that god had been founded in the 1st century BCE, that is before the Roman conquest. It was set along a sharp slope to the northeast of the city. You see the red arrow, which indicates the side of the sanctuary. And the sanctuary was designed in the typical so-called Tophet style as an open air field where stelae were dedicated both by individuals and the citizenship of the town. The excavations of various Tophet sanctuaries of Saturn or Baal Hamon in Tunisia have shown that the stele had the function to mark the place of a sacrificial depot consisting of an urn with the burnt bones of the animal victim and other vessels. The dedication of a stele formed part of a more extensive ritual where normally a sheep was slaughtered and then partly burned and partly eaten or entirely burned. The bones were collected and buried together with intact and broken kitchenware in the sanctuary. And the place where these sacrificial remains were buried was then marked by a stele. At Tuga, numerous remains of the Tophet style rites were discovered. Here you see some stele, not a very good picture, but it's a picture is the old one. So we find numerous of these stelae, more than 500, and urns with burnt offerings, and these were placed into cracks of the rock along ledges across the slope, and the rest was collected in the basement of a later temple, to which I refer later. The few published pottery sherds point to a date in the 2nd century BCE or slightly later. The stelae suggest a similar chronology. So we have very firm archaeological evidence. A part of the inscriptions is written in Neo-Punic of a type common in the area between Tuga and Magdar. In the 1st centuries BCE, as well as Latin inscriptions as the latest by dedicators whose names Citius, Gaius Julius likewise suggest the terminus postquem in the mid-late 1st century BCE. In general, the Tophet-style sanctuary outside the city was used continuously through the early mid-1st century, starting with the 2nd century BCE, through the early mid-1st century CE as the latest. Then a period of either abandonment or of very, very greatly reduced activity on the hillside followed. The reason for this lack of activity is because the cult was transferred from here to here, that is, to the very center of the city, and the temple was built on or next to the forum. In 36-37 CE, Lucius Postumius Chius, a patron of the Pagus, built a temple to Saturn together with a number of other monuments, as it is attested by an inscription. All his dedications are located in the forum area, so it is most likely that the new temple to Saturn was also built there. So it's the older plan of the forum, where we have the Saturn temple here, with indicated by an H, and here is the newest plan of the forum I've found, and here is the temple again. At the end of the 2nd century CE, however, a further translocation of the cult took place. In 195 CE, Lucius Octavius Victor Roscianus dedicated a new temple to Saturn, which was built on the site of the former Tophet-style sanctuary. So the temple went out or was transferred from the city center again to the place of the Roman Tophet, and what I indicated here as the Temple II or Second Temple of Saturn. This building had a design, a courtyard surrounded by a portico with 3 cellae. Yes, the porticos here, 3 cellae on the west side, which is very often attested in Imperial North Africa, for example, also for the Temple of Lestis in Carthage, as it is described by Bishop Wortwuldeus. I love this name. According to the excavation results, no material recorded from the hillside sanctuary can be dated between the mid-1st century CE and the construction of the temple by Roscianus at the very end of the 2nd century CE. Thus, there is a marked hiatus in ritual in that sanctuary in that time for more than 150 years. Because no stelae dating to the late 2nd or 3rd century CE have been found here, it is evident that not the old rituals, which have been performed in the Tophet-style sanctuary, these old rituals of incineration and commemoration by a stone slab were not performed, but evidently new ones which were different. The design of the sanctuary with a large open courtyard, large open space, is perfectly suited for public sacrifices in a more Greco-Roman style. That the Roman conceptions how the god has to be worshipped and depicted have been adopted is evidenced also by a marble statue of the enthroned Saturn as a decisive Roman monument. What we can detect archaeologically is a complicated sequence of changing locations and altered rituals. It is the placement of Rosciano's temple which established on the first site a connection of the new sanctuary and its cults, to the pre-Roman past. The architectural design of the sanctuary, however, was completely changed, and new Roman style rites have been introduced to venerate Saturn. So the cult practices were not adopted from the past, but were interlinked with the contemporary religious life of the city. But things were still more complicated. The temple of Roscianus belongs to the group of the so-called Hoftemple in German, or Temple au cour in French, which courtyard temples in English, which are defined by a large courtyard and celli without podium on one side. So that's here, the courtyard, and again the celli. Patrizio Benzabene, Italian archaeologist following French scholars, has argued that such plans owe their origin to Phoenicio-Punic sanctuaries, but more actual research has demonstrated that no links to pre-Roman predecessors exist. Nevertheless, Matthew McCarthy could be right when he argues that, I quote, "The plan of Rosciano's temple then is not an example of conservatism, of preserving things as they were, or of continuity with the Punic or Libyan past, but of inserting the sanctuary within an imagined sense of what might constitute traditional forms." Quote ends. What is true is that this type of temple is very common in and almost idiosyncratic for Roman Africa. If the placement of the temple created a connection with past cult practices of different kind of the site, and the plan of the temple participated in imaginations of a particular tradition, a renovation of the temple shortly after its dedication suggests how the cult could also be set into contemporary context as well. Rosciano's temple was originally entered from the east via two steps leading to a door that opened onto the portico, so-called old entrance by A indicated. There are no foundations for monumental exterior embellishments, no columns, no porch, just the stairs and the outer wall of the precinct. Soon after the temple was built, however, a new porch and facade was added to the sanctuary. 4 Corinthian columns stood atop a stylobate, these columns here, set along the front side of a porch. The fact that the stylobate sits at the same level as the entrance to the sanctuary suggests that the floor level on the porch would have been at the same level as the entryway, obsoleting the 2 steps from the earlier phase. In addition, probably as part of a third phase of reconstruction, a raised platform that was not architecturally bonded into the porch was built, extending outward. But this new facade created problems with the access to the temple. There are no traces of a staircase leveling the sharp descent between the level of the porch and the sloping ground below. Instead, a new entrance to the present has been provided via a side door, here D, and a set of rooms constructed on the south side of the portico. So, see here of this actual situation with the porticos and the original entrance, no connection. The new columnar facade, erected at some point in the 3rd century CE, did not serve as an entrance to the temple. It was built as a monumental showpiece atop a tall podium behind the visibility of the building, so you can see. Thus, the elevation of the temple, the sanctuary is as presented to those looking at it from the outside, firmly set the sanctuary in relation to the range of other temples with podia and columnar facades that had been and were being built in the town from the mid-2nd century onwards, from the Capitolium to the Temple of Pietas. As much as the temple's cult might have been framed by the constructed context of tradition in its plan, it was also set firmly within the wider sphere of the contemporary religious life of the town. The situation at Tuga in the 2nd, 3rd century CE was such that the city site of the earlier pre-Roman Tophet was reactivated as a locus of cult, though for a vastly changed set of practices. These practices, though, were framed by an architectural link to a traditional cult in the form of Rostianus temple. Here, the tie to the past is not just reimagined as a reprise of what had become before in that place, but in a more formed way via temple layout thought to be part of traditional repertoire. At the same time, the framing of the rites in temple was soon updated to set the cult not just within the sphere of tradition, but within the realm of contemporary civic display and cult design. To conclude, the literary and epigraphical examples from Carthage and the archaeological evidence at Tuga and other places which cannot be treated show that starting in the mid-2nd century CE, efforts were made to deal with the past and to redefine the relationship between past and present and between the Roman Empire and the African provinces. The field where these efforts can best be explored, which was the most important area for these practices, is, in my opinion, religion. So it has to be asked how the cults were situated in relation to the past. This did not happen in any static form, via continuous reproduction of ritual scripts, simply because there were none, but via an imaginative recreation of cultic traditions, a practice which could be termed invention of tradition. The course of activities involved is multi-layered and manifold. It is not a simple one-dimensional restoration of past cults, not to mention the continuation of an unbroken religious tradition as it is believed or postulated, but it includes new aspects and leads to completely new solutions, as it is best illustrated in the case of Tuga. The activities described have to be seen in a historical context. Since the middle of the 2nd century CE, cults to deities which were already important in pre-Roman times were integrated into the civic pantheon and recognized as sacra publica, as the epigraphical evidence, especially of Carthage, indicates. The developments described can be read as signs of a developed African identity, which are traceable also in the art context, for example, in the use of typical African cognomina, such as Fortunatus and Datus, also in families stemming from Italy, not of African origin. The big fundamental issue is, of course, identity, and this brings us back to the beginning, where the importance of memory for identity, be it individual or group identity, was stated. For me, as a classical archaeologist, it is always a problem to prove identity archaeologically. The interpretation of material culture in this respect is uncertain and mostly ambiguous. Egon Fleig, a German ancient historian, therefore turned against the Verdinglichung des Kulturbegriffs, the reification of culture. I've therefore resorted much more than usual in my studies to written sources, not only because you are perhaps more familiar with written sources than with archaeological ones. More important is that only when there is a clear accumulation of circumstantial evidence, as it is the case in the 2nd century CE, we can reasonably use archaeological sources to demonstrate the deliberate reference, be it intended tradition or not, to the past as a means of establishing and consolidating a distinct group identity. Because of this approach, we also have to rely on written sources if we want to know since when this reference to the own past can be counted on. As for the identification with Punic culture and Carthage also as a center of power, recent research on Pomponius Mela's De Chorographia provided interesting clues. The author, Pomponius Mela, according to his own accounts, come from the city of Tingitera, an otherwise unknown city near Gibraltar on the Spanish coast. However, he describes himself as a descendant of the Phoenicians, since the inhabitants of Tingitera came to Spain from Africa. Since he writes habitant in the present tense, he thus refers to Tingitana as a current Phoenician or Punic city. This occurs in the early imperial period, since we know from information in the Chorographia that the work was written in Claudian times. Until now, research has always emphasized Pomponius Mela's local patriotism, for example, because he wrote more about Africa and the Iberian coast than about Italy with Rome or about Greece, but his attitude clearly goes beyond local patriotism. A key passage is found in Book 2, paragraph 105. Opposite the Gulf of Carthage are Chiarai, Tylai, and Agatai, memorable for the Roman defeat, Romana clade memorabiles. For a long time it was believed that Mela had simply made a mistake. Chiarai, Tylai, and Agatai, the Agates Islands, were the scene of a famous naval battle in 241 BCE, in which the Romans defeated the Punic, bringing the so-called First Punic War to an end. This would be a rather devastating mistake, which is of course not impossible. Only in recent years, first by Richard Batty, later also by A. Johnston and Hugh Johnston, an alternative interpretation has been proposed, which in my opinion is much more convincing. Pomponius Mela writes not from the Roman perspective, but from the local Punic perspective. Clades Romana then does not mean disaster suffered by the Romans, but disaster wrought by the Romans. This means that Pomponius and probably also other inhabitants with a comparable cultural background identified themselves even 300 years later not with the Romans but with the Punics. At least in memory, they were on the Punic side. From this, it is evident that at least Pomponius had a competing view of history and the past in the middle of the 1st century BCE. It can also be concluded that he claimed a specifically Punic identity for himself. Certainly, this is true for an individual, in this case an intellectual, but it can be assumed that he was not an individual phenomenon, that he was only a single person. Apparently, however, it took until the middle 2nd century for broad segments of the population to develop their own African identity and for the phenomena I have described to occur. Nevertheless, one question remains open for me, perhaps also because I have just attended a conference on conflict and conflict resolution. How is it possible to achieve such a successful balance between victors and vanquished in the Roman Empire, which is how the different populations groups feel, that a harmonious or at least trouble-free coexistence was possible? But yeah, maybe we have to think about that. However, it is all about identity, and that has been criticized in the last years, since identity has become such a dominant theme in classics, also in classical archaeology, that the usefulness of dealing with the topic has already been called into question. I would like to disagree with this, as it is a much more suitable concept to describe and understand the cultural diversity that prevailed in the Imperium Romanum than old-fashioned but obviously unkillable concepts like Romanization. Identity also allows to come to terms with seemingly clear contradictions. Although Tertullian addresses the men of Carthage and accuses them of wearing the Roman toga, it was the same people, both the order as well as the local elite, who were the main agents of the incorporation of cults into the Sacra Publica and the building of sanctuaries for them. Therefore, they were responsible and were the driving force for the redefinition of the relationship with the past and the creation of an African identity. The important point has to be made that creation, or at least emphasis on an own African identity, is not an act of resistance against Roman rule. As in Greece and Asia Minor, also in Africa, being an inhabitant of the former Punic capital and aware of the Punic heritage on the one hand, and being a citizen of the Roman Colonia Carthago and a member of the Roman Empire, which destroyed evidently Carthago and the Punic polity, on the other, were not mutually exclusive. Having a positive identification with both was possible and valid, even if today we might think they contradict each other. Thank you for your patience, and thank you especially for your attention. Muito obrigado.
Ok. Para lembrar que eu tenho joelho, gente. Muito obrigado, professor Günther, né, pela sua apresentação, muito inspiradora, instigante e um desafio, né, em grande medida, com relação às abordagens teóricas que foram tratadas. So thank you, Professor Günther, for your thought-provoking presentation, very interesting, very enriching for all of us, and challenging in terms of theory and the way you approach identity, for example. So we'd like to ask you whether you are open to a few questions at this point, so we can open the floor for questions. If you're interested in leaving your questions here, you can just write them in the chat, right, for us to see them. But I would also like to ask you if I can start with the first question. So I'd like to start from the end, actually. Sorry to scratch at the hurt, but you said that you admitted yourself that it's quite difficult for you to study identity with material culture and written sources. So I'd like to start from the basics. How can we not reconcile, but conciliate written material with material culture in the first place? Because that alone is also a big problem.
Yes.
So what can you say about that for us?
Yeah, I think we have to speak more to communicate better classicists and classical archaeologists. Maybe it's a more greater problem in German-speaking countries where we have a strict separation between classical philologists and classical archaeologists than in the UK or in the US, or maybe also in Brazil. So mainly, are the, so to say, the hardcore archaeologists who excavate and who produce always new data, but are not so keen about interpreting the material. So they date it, but they are not so eager to find the historical interpretation of that. So, and for me, it would be important, firstly, to speak more or to collaborate with classicists, and to look for apt models in other subjects, maybe anthropology, sociology, and so on. What archaeology or archaeologists have been criticized, that they take material evidence at face value. So maybe the prehistorians or are here still more involved than the classical archaeologists. So they construct cultures, they extract people. So it's the so-called cultural historical approach in archaeology, where we can say all the people who were approach or who drink from a special kind of beaker or mug, that are they are the mug people, or the Zwiebelkopf people, and so on. And it's not, the main mistake in my eyes is to take material culture, archaeological evidence at face value, because identity is not, or we have no US American identity if we wear blue jeans, for example. So we have to make several and not a few steps from material evidence to looking at identity. Is this kind of answer?
Yes, but I think, well, maybe those who work only with material culture may not feel at this point very optimistic, right? Because apparently without the written sources, the chances of advancing any kind of research about identity with only material culture seems to be heading towards failure.
Yes, it's because of that I draw very much on the written sources, and then when we have a given direction, then we can try to interpret material culture. But I think, but as you
so written material seems to be a sine qua non situation, right? And without it, we would be at a dead end.
Speaking or discussing identities without written sources can end very fast in failure.
I see. Okay. And about identity itself, how much should we delve into defining what identity is? Because a few years ago, when archaeologists and historians started working with identity, one very serious concern was to explain what identity was, after all, because it was quite controversial to a certain aspect. So to a certain extent. So should we be worried about defining identity right now, or is it something that has been so much worked with that at this point, maybe this is not an important aspect to consider? Or we should be just wasting time in definitions that will always prove controversial?
Maybe the sense I used, identity, is not at the peak of the psychological discussion. So for me, it's a shortcut for speaking how people felt and how people tried to integrate several influences, or how to appropriate several genera of material culture. So for me, makes no sense to start with a discussion of identity. So at least for me, it's only a shortcut to
diversion, you think?
Yes. I read something about if it's possible to have a group identity. Is there only one individual identity? But I think for me it works. Okay. It's not the most intellectual answer, but it is a tool that helps me to come to terms with the phenomena I found in the literal and archaeological material.
I see. Well, even though we may not consider, or we may consider diversion to just linger on this topic of definition, but we may talk about markers of identity.
Yeah.
So according to your lecture, religion and so cults in general, they play a very important part here, because they are less longing, they last longer than other aspects of life. The same might be said about burials also, and aspects of funerary archaeology.
Yes.
So in terms of markers, besides religion, what else can we actually cling ourselves to at this point? In terms of, if we're always going to consider that there is written material and material culture. Okay, so we are discussing from this point of view. So what can we actually hold on to in terms of markers of identity?
Markers of identity. So the name giving, but also some.
Because you use clothing in your presentation.
Clothing, of course.
So, but just before you said, in terms of jeans for the Americans, it wouldn't work.
No.
Yeah, so sometimes clothing might be.
Of course.
A good start point, but sometimes it's not.
It's not. So, but for Tertullian, it's important for identity, and he discusses it a lot. But for example, in the iconography of North African stelae, be it motif stelae or burial tomb stelae, clothing is always the same as in the rest, or as in Italy. So there's no identity marker. What we have is different kind of architecture. So how houses were built, how the rooms of houses were arranged. So we can see that the socializing of inhabitants and guests in houses work differently in Roman North Africa than in Italy, for example, or in Roman Greece. So we have some burials, we have some hints that older forms were re-established but there is no such close or not so dense series of burials excavated that we can be sure that it's invented or really a tradition of burial rites.
So we need a kind of a serialization.
Yes,
of that.
yes.
It's
also it depends always on the evidence and how many excavations, what has been found, what can be found.
Can we risk? Because I mean, if even if we consider that maybe the odds are against us, if we don't have material, if we don't have written material, can we at least try and risk? I mean, how much academy is open to that kind of risk taking? So gambling, can we gamble a little bit there? Is there space for that, or you wouldn't be taken seriously, you think? It'd be useless, but
to gamble, yes, why not?
Yeah.
Why not?
So there is maybe some room there for maneuver.
Yeah.
I mean, so maybe we can get started, and if we're transparent enough to say, okay, maybe we have limitations, we don't know where we're going exactly, but this is an indication that maybe can open a new avenue for us. We can follow. So do you think that would be somehow accepted in some places?
If it's accepted, maybe it depends also if in a room full of archaeologists it would be more easily accepted than in a room of ancient historians or classicists.
There's still a chasm, yes, between these groups, yes. They're not working in tandem completely, as you said so yourself. Right? So this is a difficulty we have to overcome. So this is a big hurdle, really. You studied tendril friezes, right, in Roman architecture. Public buildings, can they show us something about identity as much as homes and other buildings that are not considered official? I'm not going to say private because I mean this word might not be
private
for ancient times. Okay, but still something that we would consider official buildings. So the friezes, would they tell us anything about identity?
I would say it's a very blunt, sometimes boring, boring statement. We are Roman.
I see. I was thinking of if we consider just a supposition here, a Briton traveling to Turkey in the 2nd century CE, and he comes across a relief of Claudius stabbing deadly Britannia in Aphrodisias. So he sees that image.
Yes.
Okay, so what would he think of that? I know that this answer is probably impossible, but I would like you to think about that. I mean, give it a chance to cut it some slack.
No,
what would you say about it?
As I said, for me, that's still an open question. That's really an open question. How can I establish two identities which, according to my opinion, are opposite or should contradict? So for me, it's
really paradoxal, but yet they might have coexisted, right?
Yes.
Okay. Do you think that's why Romanization is coming back?
Maybe
it's a big threat.
That's an excellent idea.
It's giving them some new hopes.
Yeah, but
I'm not saying we should surrender.
The problem with romanization is that it never was dead, at least in some countries, and because so many Italians, French, and so came to also to the UK and maybe also the British and the Dutch were a little bit bored about the theme, and the younger ones are fighting against the older ones, and so maybe also because of that romanization came back. But for me, no solution at all.
I see. Yeah, it's not a time to be tolerant about that, right?
Yeah.
We should not be complacent about that, right? And complacent, sorry, about that. We should react against that.
What do you think? What
I'm not the one.
What things of Britain in
I'm not a lecturer.
What things of
no, I think it's very thought-provoking and enticing. I don't have the answer to that, but I think that's a good thing. Maybe this will keep us employed for a long while, because we still have so many things to answer. Your lecture today was so inspiring and so rich, and you gave us an analysis which was very in-depth analysis and completely professional. And
but
so
it could not be possible without the work of many others. So
no, I know.
What I said about the temple of Tuga owes a lot on Matthew McCarthy, for example. So
and it's some revisiting, of course. But and probably you should delve deeper into that. But still, you brought us a very professional presentation here, and very well created for us. And you brought us images which are also challenging and even amusing. The last one, for example, it looks amusing, but you told us about the aspect of emic point of view and ethic point of view. How, because that's a problem with identity. Okay, what are we going to consider, the emic or the ethic position? And so this has always been a challenge. And you brought us also an aspect. So it opened doors for us. And it has opened doors, and it will certainly make us think again about those things. So for us here in Brazil, I suppose this is also very important, because, I mean, we have someone like you with your experience in excavations or your experience in working with archaeology and history for so long. And when you come to Brazil and you tell us, okay, you still have questions, okay, this also gives us hope that we can offer something else. We can offer our point of view, which might be different. Even in Brazil, we have different points of view, but we still have a chance. And maybe you can gamble a little bit. In collaboration, of course. In collaboration. But you can gamble a little bit.
No. As I said before, I'm very open.
But
I see you, of course, as Brazilians, but I see you as colleagues.
No, that's fantastic. Well, it's great. I mean, you gifted us with a lecture today, this afternoon. We're very grateful for that. Really, because it was a fantastic opportunity to get to know you better, but also to listen to you and to listen to your questions, to the issues you raised, which were quite salient and relevant for archaeology, but also history. Most of our students are historians, so, but they will have to work with material culture now and again, hopefully, especially in ancient history and even other periods or in history. So it's very enlightening, your presentation, but it's also intriguing because it shows us that there is still a lot of ground to be covered. So it's sometimes uncharted territory, yes?
And it's very important that different people with different own histories and have to discuss these topics. And I showed the last slide not only in order to show a funny cartoon, because it shows also that the difficulties of literal sources, what's emic and ethic, but also of the archaeological interpretation, because archaeologically both are the same.
Okay, yeah, of course. We have some questions here for us from the chat. Let me see. Felipe Augusto Ribeiro, a colleague of ours here in the program. Eu gostaria de fazer uma pergunta. O professor articula muito bem as fontes arqueológicas e textuais. Que cuidados metodológicos ele aconselha que o pesquisador tenha para fazer esses cruzamentos? Okay, so Professor Felipe Augusto Ribeiro is also worried about methods of entangling material culture and written material. So he also worries about the way to make them work together in the proper way. So methodologically speaking, not so much in terms of theory, I suppose, because he worked about methodology. Is there something you can tell us about how to work in a proper way with material culture and written sources?
In a proper way?
Yeah, how to analyze them, for example, how we can cross material culture and written sources. I mean, the way you analyze a written document and the way you are going to analyze, for example, a temple, because in the past, others suggested that they were both texts.
Yeah.
Yes, okay, so do you believe that? Or do
No,
you think there are major differences?
Of course not. A text is a text, and you can't read a temple as a text.
Ian Hodder was one that defended that position a long while ago in a certain way, that you should read, Ian Hodder, that you should read material culture as though it was a text. He changed his idea later on, but he approached material culture that way. So do you think it's just something that is nonsense and we should consider?
No, nonsense. No, but you have to establish own methodologies, and I think it's also worth to establish a methodology to interpret or to read, so to say, pottery. It is different to read pottery from reading a temple. So you have to be very, very careful and very, very delicate. And what's always most important is to see the context and but it's commonplaces.
Do you think written sources are more subjective than material culture? It's more objective. Do you believe in that?
Yeah, I think that we have with material culture the opportunity to address more people or to get knowledge about more people, and also people who had no strong voices or no voices at all in antiquity. So what it's mostly the famous old white rich man who wrote in antiquity, and so we hear only their perspective. But with material culture, we have at least the chance to see the children, the women, the poor ones, the peasants, and not the rich living in the cities.
And the biggest problem is that those are those who will never write.
No.
Yeah, so that's the point.
So
that's a big problem for us. It's also a big problem.
For that, we have to need material culture and to interpret archaeological evidence, even if we make sometimes a step too far. To push the
because unfortunately we're not going to expect original material coming from them, except maybe from walls where they could write a few things, like in Pompeii, for example.
Yes, we have a lot of graffiti.
Yes, so exactly. Graffiti certainly, but
other than that, only one town and in a special time. But I'm extremely interested. Maybe you mentioned it in the life of the so-called ordinary people. So 90%, at least 80% of the Romans, the inhabitants of the Roman Empire, lived not in the city, but were rural residents and were peasants. And so I try to excavate farmsteads, not even villas, but the small hamlet, small farmstead. And for that, I have only material evidence to know more about them.
Should we engage in searching how much?
I tried to establish a kind of rural identity only because of material evidence in Roman Tuscany, but it's difficult, and some accept it, if some
because probably the villa were just part of where they lived, because they also had city houses in towns and rural settlements too.
So I may ask you, would you think that using a special kind of tableware, is that a sign of identity?
No, certainly not. But we cannot deny that for many years we were in search of ways to measure how much Romanized one people was, and we were using that kind of marker. We were using also vases. We were using tableware. We were using clothing. We were using that. And I ask myself whether we can completely let go of those things, and if we do, what is left for us? So maybe we will find ourselves in a position where, okay, without written sources, maybe we should just admit that we're very limited there. And maybe that man in the Iberian Peninsula, right close to Gibraltar, when he said, okay, that was Gladys Romana, so was he really, so you said, okay, a big mistake was possible. Maybe he made a mistake, and he said that the Romans were defeated, but maybe it was something else. Maybe he was considering himself Phoenician at the time, or Roman. I mean, that's the big question always, all the time. But he's at least writing about it. But there are so many others who never did, and we'll never get to know that much about that.
And come back to the point of how to interpret material culture. We have always to see the big picture. So it is not possible to count shirts of Terra Sigillata and say they were Roman, or they were like the Romans, if they lived in the famous British round houses or huts. So we have to consider as many aspects of their life as possible.
Yeah, there's a great level of uncertainty there. And for some.
But I would always say
for some research studies, that's sometimes unbearable for people to accept that there is so much uncertainty. But some of them, they say, okay, if there is so much uncertainty, this is not science. Yes, they say, oh, if there is science, if it's science, then we would be sure of the things.
But then what's really sure in our subject?
Exactly.
So I would be always on the let's try, let's gamble side.
Yes. Sometimes when we want grants, people say, oh, but history is fiction. And so sometimes we say, okay, we prefer to give grants to archaeology, because they say that's closer to science than history. Okay, so that's very ironic.
Same with us in Austria and Germany. If you want to get money, you have to make this scientific part of your application stronger, and the interpretive part less. So how, if you apply archaeobotanical analysis or X-ray something, so it's the chance to get the money is better than if you try to write a new chapter in the history of the province X, epsilon.
Thank you for being so candid. I mean, it's a breath of fresh air for us, really. Yeah. So I think there's something else here. A question from Bruno, another colleague here from the program. So he asked, penso nisso porque autores como Código Judeus ou Tertullian, que foram citados, estão disponíveis, inclusive, em edições para línguas modernas. Sorry, I skipped one part. Sorry, I missed one part. A parte essas potencialidades da cultura material, a acessibilidade a elas não seria um problema para a pesquisa? So, difficulties to access material culture in the first place, wouldn't that be a hurdle for researchers? Como as descobertas arqueológicas estão sendo disponibilizadas à comunidade? So, how are archaeological finds being published and being divulged to the public in general? So, can they actually get to those reports? Can they get the reports? Aren't they very expensive or something like that? So when they are sold to the public, or only in libraries which are not normally available here in Brazil? Penso nisso porque autores, he thinks that way because Código Deus or Tertulliano that were mentioned are available in modern languages, but a temple or objects consulting them or analyzing them implies visiting the place in local.
No, not really. So if you not really, if you have enough depictions, you have not to be there, or if you read the publication of a temple or of a building or of an excavation, so it's sufficient. You have not to be there. No, otherwise only the very rich could, or the very old who traveled, who had the chance to travel a lot, could do archaeology, and that would be a disaster.
So phenomenology, archaeology, that's really worth getting into that. Yeah, so like touching, smells and things like that.
You can do also armchair archaeology.
Okay, great. Okay, have we got further questions? Apparently not. Okay, so considering it's almost 5 o'clock, yes, and we've been here since 3, I think we can call it a day. Yes, so thank you very much, Professor Dr. Günther Schörner. Okay, thank you for being here with us this afternoon. It was a fantastic experience and sharing so much knowledge, very enriching, very thought-provoking, really amusing and enticing. You brought us a lot to think about, and you brought us hope also. I mean, even though you have said that we have to be more careful with working with the material culture and the written sources, but at the same time, you said that there are still open ways for us, there are open avenues for us, and maybe in cooperation we can propose new approaches and new ways of looking at the issues. And so, thank you very much for being here.
No, thank you. Thank you all for attending and asking and commenting, and muito obrigado.
Ok, nós que agradecemos, muito obrigado, Professor Günther Schörner. So thank you very much once again, and thank you all for bearing with us here this afternoon. So we'll see each other soon, right? And classes are going to resume next week, don't forget. So we have a lot to talk about, and all the main issues, the lecture we had today, of course.
All the best.
All the best for you all. Thank you very much. Obrigado a todos e todas. Nos vemos, né, em outras ocasiões. Continuem assistindo ao canal do PPGH, né? E esse também é um evento que foi promovido por vários laboratórios da nossa linha de pesquisa, do Antigo ao Moderno, como Leon, Laboratório Ínsula, também, que trabalha com o período antigo e medieval das Ilhas Britânicas, né? E laboratórios também de medieval, do professor Felipe, né, que também está promovendo aqui o Leme, né, o Leme, que está também subsidiando esse evento. Né? Enfim, agradecer também ao Bruno Shoa, professor Bruno Shoa, né, a José Ibson, que está trabalhando na parte técnica, agradecendo a todos vocês que vieram e os que ajudaram a esse evento, para que esse evento acontecesse nessa tarde. Muito obrigado mesmo, bom feriado, bom São João para vocês, né, que estão aqui na região e que comemoram as festas juninas. É isso, gente, boa tarde e até a próxima. Okay? And cut.